Let me share a term and a few definitions I've encountered for it. It's a term coined, as best as I can determine, by G2Geek on the democratic blogging platform Dailycos. That term is stochastic terrorism. Noun. Definition 1. The use of mass public communications, usually against a particular individual or group, which incites or inspires acts of terrorism which are statistically probable but happen seemingly at random. Definition 2. The use of mass communication to incite random actors to carry out violent or terrorist acts that are statistically predictable but individually unpredictable. Definition 3. Remote-controlled murder by lone wolf. In other words, stochastic terrorism is the communication of a message to encourage disconnected individuals to take up violence against one's enemies, spreading rhetoric and propaganda to get someone you don't know to attack someone you dislike. This sort of behavior, does it sound familiar to you at all? Someone getting their face on TV and all over social media, pointing towards their enemies and calling for bold action, standing tough, and calls for doing the right thing from their supporters. Of course, I'm talking about Osama bin Laden, the now dead leader of Al-Qaeda, who appeared in a number of pro-Al-Qaeda videos over the years, calling for a general fight against the governments that Al-Qaeda was most specifically targeting. This spurred the original notion in the public consciousness of the lone wolf terrorist, someone inspired to take on a terrorist activity, but without having to have direct ties to the encouraging organization or person. Or maybe I'm actually talking about Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, also known as Daesh. Abu Bakr has also appeared in a number of videos and audio recordings which generally contain calls for Muslims to come to the territories his organization controls to join their fight, or at the very least to fight their enemies, aka pretty much everybody. Add in a boatload of fancy Photoshop propaganda memes and you get car bombings, shootings, stabbings, plane crashes, and trucks plowing into crowds, all of which have resulted in total in thousands dead and injured across the world. Or perhaps I'm talking about neither of those two. Perhaps I'm talking about someone who is on TV daily across America, painting his opponents as not just as enemies, but inhuman, dangerous, and threats to everything his supporters most hold dear. A man, given he's an American that's at least a little savvy about such things, actively avoids calling for direct violence, but who is more than eager to approve of it in others, to excuse or ignore it when it happens, and to constantly point fingers at the specific individuals who most threaten his ideological stranglehold over his supporters even the least bit. A man who is backed up by a group of folks very eager to spread his message on TV and online. Yes, I'm of course talking about Donald Trump. In recent days, there have been a series of bombs set to various individuals across the country. Democratic leaders, past, such as Obama and the Clintons, and present, such as Maxine Waters, a Dem-supporting philanthropist, George Soros, as well as others. All of these individuals have, beyond their political leanings, something in common. They've all been named explicitly by Donald Trump in his various taunting fits. Since the first bomb was discovered, a suspect has been arrested. He was identified via fingerprint matches from the bombs and previous arrest records, as well as a few other pieces of evidence, apparently including his specific style misspellings on his social media pages. Now, the right, from the highly paid Republican pundits right on down to the internet trolls, began screaming early on that all this was a false flag op. The claim was the Democrats, some far-left group, or some sort of secret super cabal of rogue FBI agents or something, was behind the bomb plot in order to slant the election, given that it's, about a week away. Beyond the obvious reasons that none of these made any much sense, after all, if you are a Democrat, leftist, or Dem-supporting secret cabal of rogue FBI agents, which is not a thing, by the way, then why would you try to murder the Democratic Party's most popular people, plus some others, who are honestly not all that important at all, even to the most intense leftists? This storyline was a deliberate attempt to prepare the faithful for the obvious, that the person or persons behind the attack was a Republican. And given the information that I have at this point suggesting that the man in custody is the one behind it, that appears to be exactly the case. A Republican who has attended Trump rallies, who was known by his former co-workers as being excessively racist, and who plastered his creepy van with pro-Republican and anti-democratic propaganda stickers, is now in custody and has been charged for this act of terror. And no one is the least bit surprised. including those who were pre-spinning the story, to build up a cloud of deniability when the obvious MO led to the obvious motive by the obvious suspect, protect their brand and to protect their president. They were acting to prevent the right's core and fringe supporters from recognizing what this game is. And that game is stochastic terrorism. The president targeted these individuals with his rhetoric. The right-wing media, the online propagandists, domestic and foreign, and the foot soldiers all across the country repeated the message. And one of those foot soldiers, one of those true believers, decided that it was time to start murdering. Which one that would end up taking action was difficult to predict, of course. Unless, I guess, you knew this guy specifically, given what I'm learning from the people most experienced with him. But this man was perhaps a bit more difficult to predict as being the perpetrator by some far-off anti-terrorism squad or some internet rando like myself. But given the implied calls for action against his enemies, Donald Trump was in effect calling on this man to try to murder people. The game is played this way to protect the instigator. The man who set the bombs will go to prison, perhaps for the rest of his life. But the man who started the call to action will not for this act. Nor will any of those intermediaries who are also complicit. This is the game that men like Donald Trump play. He wants Second Amendment people to shoot his opponents, but will only say that maybe they should do something about him later when asked about it. He wants you to know that if you body slam a protester, he's got your back, implying that maybe you should go out and do it. And he says things like, please, don't be too nice, to police to encourage them to deliberately injure or to encourage injury to people in their custody, regardless if they're innocent or not. And then, oh yeah, the media over there, they're the bad guys, and that John Brennan guy over there, yeah, he's just a big meanie. He's unfair and stuff. Oh, and by the way, George Soros is behind all of this. Wink! So, it's kind of obvious what he's doing. The right knows that. They know what the game is. Hell, they endorse this behavior. Love him for it. Love him for these calls for violence, implied as they are. This call for action against their perceived enemies is like a drug, after all. That so happens to get some of them to build bombs and murder people. Hint, this bomb thing is just the latest, well, formerly latest, and one of the more notable, as it involves bombs, instead of the usual right-wing extremists just getting a gun and killing people. Where was I? Oh yes, the drug metaphor. It's addictive, very addictive. And so, you gotta protect the source, gotta make the propaganda to make the right, make it, look like it's a paragon of virtue in all of this, somehow. To make the right and the Trump look like they're just so cool, man. And that they're an ideal that can do no wrong. Ugh. While at the same time, bolstering the calls for targeting and violence. And that, oh, we're innocent, honest guys act is maybe the only thing separating Trump and his supporters from a group like Al-Qaeda. Removing the need to play nice, and what do you get? Well, you already have the calls for violence, mostly implicit from the president, and, when you drill down to the meme level, it's pretty damn explicit. I mean, just look at the pipe bomber's van and those crosshairs all over left-leaning political actors. So if you remove the need to pretend that everything is actually fine and all those right-wing people shooting, bombing, and running over people just don't actually exist somehow, what happens then? You know what? I don't actually want to find out, but I fear we already are. I had maybe 1,000 words more scripted that came after that question, and I had a different answer to it. Doing my usual thing of calling on people to get out and vote and to oppose the Republican Party by voting them out of office this election, next, and many more that follows until such time as this habit of stochastic terrorism they are so enamored with finally ends. Some talk about propaganda and the indoctrination of the right space into paranoid conspiracy theory land, which other people do better than I do. Let's admit to that. As well as a robust defense of democracy as the primary tool to turn things around. And you know what? I still believe in that message. And as happens so often when I take too long writing a script and getting it recorded, the world continues. Between my initial draft, which was basically everything before that question, and the rest of this essay now, I was made aware of a killing by a white supremacist. Not the one you're thinking of. Probably. A man with a gun tries to enter a predominantly black church with murder on his mind. Failing to get inside, he headed to a nearby grocery store and killed 2 elderly African Americans. The victims, Maurice Stallard and Vicky Jones. The shooter was confronted by a white guy at some point, but instead of shooting him too, he declared, "Oh, whites don't kill whites." Pretty obvious motives there. While still pondering how to rework this essay around that fact, this new bit of evidence, I found myself alerted again. This time to a mass shooting by another white supremacist, this time targeting a synagogue. It left 11 people dead. This one had me the most scared. I have a number of friends who live in Pittsburgh, and I know at least one of them is Jewish. Not knowing our habits, initially I feared the worst, and I and the rest of her friends were greatly relieved to hear from her that afternoon. It wasn't her synagogue, and she was nowhere nearby. Good news, yes. But the friends and family of the 11 victims were not so lucky. The man who murdered that day posted frequently on the alt-right run Gab platform, and before the shooting had posted this: "Can't sit by and watch my people get slaughtered. Screw your optics. I'm going in." Forgive me by pointing out the obvious, but there's not a campaign of murder against old white guys. The refugee caravan that the right-wing media has been all aghast over, that's, hundreds of miles away from the U.S. border, and they're doing everything they can to use the campaign issue to scare the voters into action. It's not the threat they claim it to be. Those people there aren't coming here to murder anyone, guys. But the president speaks and poses the fear. Fox and talk radio push the narrative to a higher pitch, and more radical white supremacist terrorists appear and start murdering. In a single week, 3 men with murder on their minds. 3 men, all steeped in the paranoia of the Republican Party. 3 men seeking to punish their enemies for imagined slights took action. And now 13 people are dead. And pipe bombs keep turning up in the mail. I believe in the power of democracy to change the world and to make our lives better. Because it's a system where we the people have an opportunity, if we choose to take it, to hold those in power accountable for their actions. And right now, those in power, the senators, representatives, and governors of the Republican Party, as well as the sitting president and all the local elected officials, are engaged in a reign of stochastic terrorism against the people of the United States. I ask that on Election Day, or sooner if you can, you vote against them, supporting the Democratic candidate for every office. Because if we are going to stop the bullets, we need to cast our ballots. To end this video, I'll tell you about one of those who survived the recent massacre. Judah Summit. He was running late to the Sabbath service and thus arrived after the shooting started. He remained in his car after being warned of what was going on. Later, he mentioned what came to his mind after the shooting. His time in a concentration camp during the Second World War. Judah is 80 years old. He was only a child when he was liberated by American soldiers in World War II. After the shooting, he said, "It never ends." That was my thought. The price of democracy isn't lives or blood or money, but eternal vigilance. To be able to see through the lies and deception of those that seek to tear us apart and to encourage murder. To take part in this great experiment and hold accountable those seeking to do us harm through the use of these independent, lone wolf, right-wing terrorists. The phrase, "kick the bums out," is a bit cliche, but might be the only way we can start to end this ugly chapter in our nation's life. And if we fail, well, the alternative is too terrible to think about.